Hello everyone, welcome to the first episode of Back to Watercolors. This is a new series on my channel to document my growth using watercolors. Today is a great day because not only do I get to share all of my lovely watercolors I've collected over the past couple of years and months, I also get to get this ball rolling and start this new chapter in my art journey. So thank you for being here today. This episode is an introduction to all of my current watercolor palettes. Some of them I've used a lot over the past years, and then some of them are not open and haven't been used. But at the end of this entire series, I hope to know all of my watercolors very well and get to use every single palette and an artwork that I would like to share with all of you throughout the episodes. This palette here is a new one to my collection of watercolors. Most of the paints consist of Daniel Smith and Schmincke watercolors, all of them granulating. You've probably seen them here and there in some of my artworks lately. This is a Prima watercolor palette, Vintage Pastels. I have not opened or used this watercolor palette yet, but I hope in this coming episodes in the series to actually open up these paints and share my experience here with you. This next palette is also Handmade watercolor. These Handmade watercolors are from ArtByWaiyi Handmade watercolors on Etsy. I'll link both of the shops that I got my handmade watercolors from in the description box if you're interested in them. They're also granulating, but I believe both artists have non-granulating watercolors on their website as well. At the moment, this is my main watercolor palette for mixing skin tones. Also my fun palette with random colors from all of the collection of watercolors that I currently have. So it's a little bit of everything. It's a whole mixing pot, but mainly I use this because I just didn't like how my skin tone mixes with gouache was going, and I wanted to try something new. This palette is my first artist professional quality watercolors. All of them in this palette are Magello Mission Gold watercolors, and as you can see, there's quite a dip into this palette. After I got these watercolors, I stopped using student grade watercolors and just focused on using these watercolors in all of my paintings up until recently. So I've had this watercolor palette the longest, and it's gotten me through a lot of great paintings. I have very fond memories of this watercolor palette. Now it's time for the demo art showcasing how I use each of my watercolor palettes. I start out with my main palette using my skin tone mixes and a new addition to this palette, Perylene Green. For the background, I use Fairy Turquoise from my Handmade watercolor palette because I really love the granulation of greens and blues. From my main palette, I squeezed out a couple of colors that I wanted to experiment with and see if I like them. So one of them is Wisteria and the other blue color is Lavender. Both of them have white pigment in it, so it does move differently than other traditional watercolors that don't have white in it. So I wanted to see how I would like it and what I could use it for in my watercolor practice. One of my new obsessions is Perylene Green. I have 3 different tubes from 3 different brands that I would love to experiment with in the next episode, where I will be demonstrating how to make a watercolor palette that fits your needs. Right now, I just used my Perylene Green from Daniel Smith. While I was waiting for the other tubes to show up, I decided to use Perylene Green for the background because I wanted a light to dark green shift in my paintings, kind of giving it a morning to night atmosphere in the background. And I just love the way that Perylene Green looks. I know that different brands, their Perylene Green shifts more blue, some of them shift more green, so I'm excited to experiment and see which one that I like the best, or maybe I won't be able to choose and I will like them all equally. I don't know, but I'm excited to share it all with you in the next episode. What I found most challenging was deciding whether or not I wanted to create some abstract shapes for the background. I kind of debated whether or not I wanted to make some leaf shapes or not, and I decided to kind of insinuate some leaf shapes but not really try too hard. Because this was a demo painting, I didn't want to spend too much of my time trying to figure out all the technicalities. I only gave myself about 4 hours to do this painting just for that purpose of it being a demo painting and not trying to make it perfect. I just wanted to showcase some of the colors that I had from each palette and mainly use my new granulating handmade watercolors. So most of the painting is done using those two palettes. For the scarf, I was in between two different colors. One of the colors was deep sea and moody purple, and I wanted it to gradually fade from dark to light. And the other color mix that I had in my head was deep sea and indigo purple. So I used my sketchbook to kind of make that gradual shift, and I ended up going with deep sea and moody purple. Interestingly enough, I had less granulation using deep sea and moody purple than when I used deep sea and indigo purple. So I would like to kind of tackle that mystery a little bit more in a future painting, but I was very impressed by how deep I could get that deep sea. It's one of my favorite paints in my handmade watercolor palettes, and it almost reminds me of how Payne's Gray works, but almost like a deeper blue. I also was very impressed by how much the paint wanted to flow onto the paper. As soon as there was water, the paint moved so nicely. I was very impressed. I really loved it. So kudos to Handmade paints, because I didn't think it was gonna flow that much, and I was very impressed and very happy because I like those little happy accidents and just having fun, letting watercolor do its thing. The reason why I went with cold pressed paper instead of my typical hot pressed paper is because I wanted to showcase that granulation. The reason why I picked these paints from these handmade watercolor Etsy shops was because they had beautiful granulation, and I feel like you really get to see that when you use cold press watercolor paper. You can still see granulation on hot press paper, but it's not as poppy and in your face, I think, as with cold press paper. So that's why I decided to go with using cold press paper for this painting. I do find myself gravitating towards cold press papers, especially when I want to do a heavily granulating watercolor painting. My only problem is that I don't really like Fabriano's cold press paper. It's the studio grade, and I just really don't like the texture when I paint portraits on it. So I just don't know what to do. I do have some cold press cotton watercolor paper, so maybe once I am brave enough to use them, I will fall in love with cold press paper. I'm just not sure yet. I feel like cotton paper just makes everything look good anyway, so I don't know if it's gonna be the texture that's throwing me off, or maybe it's just this brand, but I hope to be able to, open up my cotton paper and be brave and just use it and see if cold pressed paper can be part of my art practice. I did notice that one of the brands of cotton paper that I have that is hot pressed does have a bit of texture in it, so you can see some granulation, but I am curious to see if cold pressed paper is a little different and if I can make it work for my painting practice. Thank you so much for being here and watching the first episode. I hope to see you all in episode 2. I hope you really liked the painting as well and had fun spending time with me. I hope to see you all in episode 2. Bye. Take care.